The planet is heating up.
The oceans are becoming filled with plastic.
Change starts now. Change starts now.
We're on a countdown
To zero waste. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This is the Zero Waste Countdown Podcast. Here's your host, Laura Nash.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Zero Waste Countdown podcast and radio show. Today, we're speaking with Jason Rosamond. He's the chairman and founder of NewLife Forest Restoration. It's a lumber manufacturer with sawmills in Arizona, and they're actually working closely with the U.S. Forest Service on a zero waste initiative, which we're going to find out all about. So, Jason, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
So let's find out all about what's going on in Arizona. So your mission is to protect Arizona from catastrophic wildfires. How do you plan on doing this? And tell us a little bit about your mission with keeping the forests healthy.
Sure. Essentially, the forests of Arizona are under the stewardship of the U.S. government and the U.S. Forest Service. The vast majority of the forests are. And the Forest Service has created a program called the Forest Restoration Initiative, which is designed to restore forests to their more natural state. They've become overgrown through a series of incidents over time. They've become overgrown with significant understory. And that understory, if it catches on fire, creates a ladder effect where the fire starts down low, in small brush, and then it moves up into medium-sized trees and eventually large trees, and it reaches the crown and creates something called a crown fire, which is incredibly dangerous. It's hard to control. It's hard to put out. And so our job to restore the forests are to remove some of the understory, leaving the larger trees behind to thrive, but without that, ever-present risk of catastrophic wildfire.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of stuff on the bottom that can really burn. And so my understanding, and you can tell me if this is correct, that if you have a lot of big giant trees and it is cleared out on the bottom, that you don't really get these forest fires because there's not a lot to light up the bottom, which means the top is never going to light up and the bark is thick enough on those big trees that's kind of how it works. And then you don't get these big fires. Is that kind of right?
That's right. The simplest way of thinking about it is the larger trees, the branches you don't see branches on a tree until it's about 40% higher than the base of the tree. So there's no branches on the bottom for a fire to catch hold of. And so when the fire hits the base of a tree, which is, just thick with bark, it might scorch it, but it won't catch it on fire. So once you remove the understory, you significantly reduce the risk of having a big wildfire.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually grew up doing this. So I grew up on a 50-acre woodlot, and my father estimates that he probably tripled the wood cordage on that 50-acre plot while harvesting it the whole time. For wood, he did our family home for, I think, nearly 40 years. And so I've seen my whole life sustainable forestry practices going on, and he was kind of aware of that. Is you want to take some of the dead stuff away and some of that littler stuff and some of the dead stuff, but of course you want to leave some of the dead stuff because they make good wildlife homes. And so there's this really cool mix that you can do with selective forestry. And so I'm thinking that is your process, right? Is this called selective? Because I guess it is, right? That you're selecting a certain type, right?
Yeah. There's a prescription that's put out by the Forest Service where they use silviculture to identify exactly which of the smaller trees should be removed. What the canopy cover needs to be. Are there diseased trees? So some overstory needs to be removed. So they use a very sophisticated scientific process to analyze the entire basal area and come up with an end plan, and we then follow that prescription. So if they say, remove all the trees that are not marked with the big red X, and that's literally what happens. And then that's what we do. We go and remove all the trees and brush and all the branches and take them all out of the forest.
Yeah, so you have these tree markers that go in first, so it's like a process, right? So they go in and mark the trees based on all of these criteria.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's kind of like how thinning works, I guess. And then you're working with 4 different national forests in Arizona, is that right?
That's right. It's the Full Forest Restoration Initiative. So it's Coconino, Tonto, Apache Sitgreaves, and Kaibab Forest, National Forest.
So it's so cool because, way up here in Canada, I've been to Arizona. I've talked about on the show before that I've kayaked the Grand Canyon, but I don't really associate forest when I think of Arizona. I guess you've probably heard this before, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's got a very diverse environment. So in obviously, in the low level areas in the valley, it's desert and extremely hot conditions. And then as you rise up towards Flagstaff or Payson, you literally just drive uphill for 2 hours, from the valley to get to Phoenix. I mean, to get to Flagstaff. And as you start getting higher and higher in elevation, the trees start to grow, and suddenly you've got these massive Ponderosa pine forests. And in fact, the largest contiguous Ponderosa pine forest in the United States is found in Arizona.
Wow. Yeah, I never would have thought that. That's so interesting. And so we talk about restoring these forests, but wouldn't a natural process of the forest be to have all this little shrubbery and like these little trees growing and kind of make a mess underneath? So how
No,
is that like not
no.
natural?
Yeah, no. So normally, what happens before we got here, and started messing around with the forest, what would happen is there would be, say, a lightning strike, and there would be a small forest fire, and it would just clear out all the shrubs and understory. There wouldn't be any medium-sized trees, right? And so they couldn't catch up to the branches on the larger trees, and they would just wipe that out. And actually, the heat from those little fires is what triggers seeding, and so the trees would then, let off their seeds, and that's how you get regeneration. But what we did is we started putting out those little tiny forest fires, and so that there were no fires going through and clearing through the small brush, and allowing those small brush to become medium-sized trees, and that's again where you get that ladder effect.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a little bit of like meddling. And I've heard too, like in California and in British Columbia, that when you don't have the forest fires, so that when humans are actively putting them out to protect homes and towns, that I guess that's why, because you get this middle growth that can ladder it up to the canopy. So I always knew that, I just
Correct.
didn't really put the latter explanation into effect. So now if you're listening and you're talking about forest fires, if you didn't know that, now that's another interesting point to talk about. Forestry is so important in the world, and we see down in the Amazon that a lot of it is being cleared for farmland. I've been down there, I've walked through the burns. The jungles like in Borneo are really sad, where those orangutans are like punching the bulldozers and stuff. Like, it's so sad. I don't know if it was a bulldozer, some sort of construction equipment. And then even in British Columbia, I don't know if you've heard about this, Jason, but in the Fairy Creek area on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, they're protesting. I think they're still going actually right now, and it's because they're logging this ancient old growth. Have you heard about those at all?
I haven't heard. Of course, I've heard many stories about old growth and interfering with old growth, but not that particular story.
Yeah, it's quite sad to me because I know that trees can communicate to each other. Like, the massive trees can send these things through the microbial areas underneath the soil to help out the smaller trees and so on. Like, they kind of communicate in this weird way with each other. And so I think clear cuts are quite sad to me. And I think that, selective is so much better. So I like that I can talk to you from a sawmill because I do support the forestry industry. Like, wood is an amazing product, and there is a good way of doing it with selective process, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's sustainable forestry. So what we're trying to do is to, of course, right now restore the forests to their natural state, which requires removing, vast amounts of the kind of medium and small trees. But even going forward, the forests continue to grow, and they will become overgrown again if we don't sustainably manage them. And so the idea is that sustainability, things like clear cutting, those all need to be things of the past. and messing around with old growth, shouldn't be done. If there's an old tree that's diseased, that's a different
Yeah.
story, right? So, we have to be very careful. We don't want to say, don't cut any big trees. Well, sometimes you have to let the younger trees regenerate if some of the older trees, have defects or would otherwise cause problems.
Yeah, and if they're kind of on their way out anyway, we have an oak that's nearly 200 years old and it's mostly dead. And so, we haven't cut it yet, but we're thinking like if we cut it, we can probably still get a lot of wood out of it. But if we just leave it there, it's dead anyway, and then we don't get the wood because it's gonna
Yeah,
rot, right?
right. Right.
So, but it's like so sad because it's so big and huge. But there are all these other oaks in the same oak grove, and one is gonna take over the giant kind of
That's
mom
right. That's
tree.
right. They all need a chance to grow.
Yeah, yeah. So that's pretty cool. And let's talk about your zero waste initiative. And I'm assuming that refers to using all the products that you're clearing out. Is that right?
That's right. So we make every effort. So if there's a tree that's more than 3 feet high and more than an inch thick, we have to remove it. It's not really a tree, is it? But our job is to remove everything, and we want to try to make use of everything. And so we will make wood chips, for example, for gardens, and work with a bagging company to bag those and color those, and people can use it for mulch. So there's a vast array of products we make, other than, of course, typical lumber products, where we try to use the smallest portions of everything we take out of the forest and put some use to it.
Yeah, and wood chips are really good for animal bedding as well because I use some for around my house for different animals. So that's another use that I'm sure people are using that for.
Absolutely, yeah. Animal bedding, and they can be either bagged or sold in bulk, uh, depending on who your customer is. They're also, we can make pellets out of it. So for wood fire stoves, so home pellets and also industrial pellets. There's just so many different applications. If you think about all the products that are on the market that are made out of wood, you can basically find a way to use all of the components you're taking out of the forest. The only thing you can't really use are pine needles. So it's very hard to find a use for those.
I heard some of them are from white pine at least are good for anti blood clotting for tea, but don't take my medical advice at all, but you can Google that if you're if
I
you're
haven't heard
interested.
that one, but we'll put that on the list to look at.
I only heard from white pine, so I don't know about the other ones. I was just surprised because yeah, you'd think pine needles. What on earth are they good for? But and so what is engineered wood? Is that like
Hmm.
sprayed wood or something?
No, so the cost of forest, and I'm sorry, this is going to be a long-winded answer, so my apologies, but the cost of forest restoration is higher than a typical harvesting exercise because we're removing branches and tops of trees and understory and making timber stand improvements by removing all these small components. That's actually an expensive exercise, and so part of that is, okay, we have restoration grade timber is what we call it, that we're removing, which is very low grade. And so the engineered wood products, what that does is it takes low grade timber and it cuts the lumber out that we make from that into small pieces. And during that cutting process, it removes any of the defects like knots or other blemishes, glue the pieces back together, and it makes a high grade product. So you take something that you might, a low grade piece of lumber that you might sell for $300, you cut out 12% of it, which are defects, glue it back together, and you then have something that sells for $2,000. And this is a way that we can actually pay for the restoration work we do, by taking the timber that we're pulling out and upgrading its value.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of that either. That's pretty interesting because yeah, some of the knots and things can be quite problematic, right? If
Yep.
you're trying to get good lumber. So, and can you get regular lumber as well? Because you're saying anything over 3 feet tall. So I imagine you still would get some, maybe some 2x4s and stuff, or is that the right kind of wood? I'm not
Yeah, so
sure.
we don't make 2x4s because we primarily have Ponderosa pine, which is an appearance grade lumber. But yes, we do have
Okay.
dimensions that we pull out of it, like 1x6 or 1x8. And all of the lumber that we start with for the engineer plant is, like a 1x6 or 1x8. It's very knotty wood because it's lower grade. You're not taking out the good trees, right? You're leaving those behind to grow and flourish. You're taking out, disease trees, blemish trees, smaller trees that have more knot structure. And so what we said is, hey, let's find a way of actually making this pay for itself, so it doesn't have to be subsidized by government. And the way we've done that is through this engineered wood plant.
Yeah, I would imagine if something's growing underneath the canopy that I mean, depending on where the light's hitting, but yeah, maybe it would kinda get it would twist and turn if it has to try to find the light, whereas if something just grows in a open field, it can kinda grow or no, I guess that's not true either because I tried to plant an endangered butternut species and I was told to put it in between some trees, like, with a adequate space, but that would actually keep it straight. So,
Yeah.
I'm not
So
sure.
what happens is the younger trees, you've got a lot of branches that are at the base of the tree because it's just growing.
Mhm.
So that's what causes a knot, is the branch coming out of the side of the tree. And eventually,
Yeah.
as the tree grows, the branches are higher up. And so when you cut a larger tree, you've got a big base at the bottom, which is clear because it doesn't have any branches on it.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have very many of those. Everything we're cutting is smaller that has branches everywhere. So we have knots everywhere. And that degrades the value of the lumber because it's not as structurally sound. And it's also not as pleasing to the eye when you've got all these black marks all over the place.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, because those logs are, like, pretty valuable, right, with the bigger trees. So, you mentioned something, though, that it does take a lot of money to go and do this. So, I think that that's the main reason why people clear cut is because you just go and wipe it all down, and I would imagine it's expensive to use all their heavy equipment that they're using to clear cut, but it's a lot of manual labor to go out in the forest with a chainsaw or with any of this other equipment and use it by hand and have to get the logs out. So when I was younger, we had a horse and my dad would hook up a log or something and like skid it out to the truck. And that actually did the least amount of damage to the forest because you could, you don't have to cut a road to get into the tree you're cutting down. You can, horses are very maneuverable. So I would imagine that, yeah, it is a lot of work. So are you hiring a lot of people? Does this create a lot of jobs? Is it hard work for people? Do they like it? Like, how is that aspect of this project?
Yeah, so we still use machinery, heavy duty machinery. It's just that we don't cut down all the trees. We go cut one and then go cut one somewhere else, et cetera. Right. So we move the equipment around. It's much more difficult. Takes a lot longer to do, but it's still all done by a machine. And we use, like you were saying, we use skid trails. The skid trails we design in advance to have the least amount of input on the forest. We get them approved by the Forest Service. Once we close out the work areas that we work in, we try to erase any visibility of where that we were actually there, right? And so it does take a lot of effort, much more than if you were doing something as onerous as or as awful as clear cutting. It takes much more work, and therefore is much more expensive. But yeah, we have
Yeah.
lots of staff. There's lots of jobs. We're hiring another probably 200 people over the next year.
Wow.
As we continue to grow and expand, we've got a new super mill that we're building next door to our engineered wood plant, and that will be live. And we've got to hire a lot of people for that and really help us with our mission.
Good. That's great. I think that jobs are really good when we're creating them, and technology is kind of taking some of them away, and so it's good to be doing this kind of stuff, and then protect the forest from forest fires, and do selective logging or sorry, selective forestry because it's not really logs unless they're diseased or something, right? So this is really great. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. So, how did you get into forestry, and what's your background?
Wow. So I lived in London for 20 years and was actually went to business school there and was working for a large multinational IT company and retired from there in 2008 and was looking for what the next goal would be and decided that I wanted to get into sustainable development to try to make the world a better place and prove that you can actually do things with an economic return that actually improve the environment and help communities. And I was actually introduced to this project. I was looking at doing some power plant work, and I was introduced to this project by someone who was working on a potential power plant solution using, which would have used residual waste from your harvesting activities to actually gasify and create electricity from the residual products. And I decided to take on the project, and that was back in 2013. And it's been just slowly, steadily building up the business and footprint that we have here in Arizona ever since.
So that's very interesting. And you never picked up the accent at all, I don't think, from living over there. So I just have a question about that though, because I worry about like biomass, right? Is that what it was?
Biomass. So that's one of the residual products, yeah, that we have out of
Yeah.
the forest.
So I think that it would be great if we are taking the stuff that you're taking with New Life Forest Restoration. But I always worry, like, what if people just go and clear cut or take down a forest or something to supply those power plants? Like, is there a risk of that happening, or is there a lot of regulation in that part of
Yeah,
the?
not in Arizona. There isn't. There's a lot of regulations.
Good.
Yeah, so in Arizona, everything is regulated by the NEPA approval process, and all the for forests restoration activities are governed by that very strict, stringent process. Our job is to work with the Forest Service and identify with them the areas that they would like us to restore and get to work. People can't just come in and clear cut national forests, right? No, that's not going to happen.
Good, because we have a problem with that in Canada. Unfortunately, there's a lot of it. So it's good to hear. I always thought that you guys had some really good national park kind of things going on because I did a lot of kayaking around there and I was pretty impressed with, the rangers. They're always there, making sure you're not doing anything wrong. Whereas Canada's a bit more wild and, there's a lot more kind of bad stuff I think that goes on in Canada. Like you see people dumping trash and, camping all over the place and clear cutting and I've been in the home of like the owner of a major logging company in BC, and he's like, "Meh, trees are weeds; they'll grow back," and that was sort of his explanation for clear cutting. And he had all this money, and he had a helicopter, and I don't know, it just seemed like not the greatest thing. So it is nice to hear that you guys have some more regulations down there, and I think it's good for Canada to know that your forests do seem to be managed quite well, in my opinion anyway. So we do have a few more minutes. Was there anything else that you would like to talk about New Life?
I think the only thing I would add is that we're trying to come up with a blueprint of how to do sustainable forest restoration to prevent catastrophic wildfire that can be used in lots of different places.
Like
And
California?
yeah, like California, Oregon, even Vancouver, right? The Vancouver area or British Columbia. I mean, there's lots of things that we've learned over the last few years about what it takes to successfully, profitably, sustainably complete forest restoration activities. And, once we finish building this next mill, I think we'll have all the pieces in place. And we'd like to share that with the world. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, is because hopefully people can learn from what we've done and replicate it.
Yeah, that's great because we actually had a giant fire in Lillooet. And if you're listening and you've ever been to the Lillooet area, so it's north of Whistler. So if you go to Vancouver and you keep on going, it actually turns into a desert. And I've noticed a lot of Canadians don't know that we have a desert, but it's full of cactuses and it's definitely a desert. But there was a very, very bad fire. And I think it was last spring, like in 2021, and it really burned down most of the town and it was so fast. And so I don't know what happened there and I don't know if this would have helped. I don't know too much about it, but like fires are just absolutely tragic because they can do so much damage and leave people without power if they still have their homes, right? So it is a good thing to do this forestry practice. And Michael Shellenberger, who we had on the show as well, I don't know if you've heard of him, Jason, but he wrote Apocalypse Never. And I follow him on social media, and he talks a lot about the poor forestry management and how California really kind of needs to get on board with managing the fires. And a lot of the news, like the major news outlets, will just be like, "Oh, it's climate change. Fires are getting worse because of climate change." And he's saying, "Well, no, it's because we're not managing the forests, basically, and it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with climate change." So I found that kind of an
Yeah, I
interesting.
think there's two points. One, so climate change, because the forests are not managed properly, climate change is allowed to have an impact on it. So as it gets hotter, obviously there's a higher risk of drought and extensive forest fires. But
Mhm.
if the forests were managed properly in the first place, then the risk would be mitigated because there wouldn't be the understory to catch on fire and create these crown fires. So it's kind of both. Now that they are overgrown, climate change does have a big impact. If they weren't overgrown, then we wouldn't even have to raise climate change in the same sentence.
And humans, right? Like humans are just everywhere. So the more humans are
Yeah,
going into the forest or building into the forest or developing into there, developing homes and whatever, then you get the cigarette, that falls on the
sure.
ground and the
Or the spark
campfire.
from a piece of equipment or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that is also very dangerous as well, right? So
That's right.
yeah. Well, this is pretty cool. So I don't know too much about Arizona, but I learned today that there are four big forests there, and Ponderosa Pines. I've definitely heard about those. They sound like beautiful trees. Are there other major kinds of trees there as well? Like I'm assuming they're all kind of coniferous trees, right? Because of the desert.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
and the
correct.
mountains.
I mean, there are, there is Doug fir here and some white pine, but for the most part, it is ponderosa pine. Vast majority is ponderosa pine.
Hmm. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. We have a totally different forest system where I live now above the Great Lakes. And yeah, it's very, very different than going out to the West Coast, that's for sure. And the forestry, the logging trucks are a lot different. They're quite tiny compared to out there. And if you are listening, I encourage you to look up the American chestnut tree and what happened to them on the East Coast if you're here as well. So when Jason, you're talking about these trees and how they get so huge and then they don't really have a fire risk, and actually the fire comes in and it sprouts or whatever it does to the pine cones to make them grow into the smaller ones. The American chestnut, if you look at the old pictures from the 1800s before they kind of got wiped out, they're massive, massive, massive trees. They're huge. They're just giant. And there were reports of people walking through the chestnuts, and they were like 3 feet thick on the ground. There was just so many. So that kind of gives me a good idea of what an ancient, healthy forest looks like. And it kind of ties into what you're saying about these bigger trees and not having that ladder effect that can bring the fire up to the top, right?
Absolutely. In fact, when we talk about forest restoration and restoring to their more natural state, what they've done is they've taken photographs from the 1800s and said, this is what the forest used to look like. This is what it needs to be returned to.
History is so important.
Indeed.
Yeah, I'll have to Google some of the Ponderosa Pine photos and see. And yeah, if you're listening, check out those old American chestnut forests, because it's just crazy how cool they were. And they're really lumpy as well. Like they make the ground really lumpy, which is, you'll see if you see in the pictures, but there's like these big dips and grooves. So it's not just like a flat area. It's very up and down. And it really changes the landscape when you get those old trees in there. So yeah, this has been really cool, Jason. So thank you for, working in IT and being across the pond and then deciding that you're going to go on another mission and make the world a more sustainable place, because it sounds like this project is definitely going to do that. So very cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for telling me there's a desert up in Canada. I'm going to have to check it out someday.
Yeah, there is. It's really cool. I saw a cougar on a river trip up there, and there's a really good rafting company if you're into that goes on the Thompson River. It's called Cumsheen Rafting. It's owned by a really nice family, and it's a cool place to stay if you're ever traveling through the desert up to Kamloops. And it's a really nice river. Yeah, with big rapids, so be ready if you go, if you're going up there. Awesome. That was Jason Rosamond. He is the chairman and founder of NewLife Forest Restoration. It's a lumber manufacturer with sawmills in Arizona.
Change starts now.
This is the Zero Waste Countdown Podcast.